and welcome back to my Unity tutorial series. If you're unfamiliar, the previous episode was the first one and concerned basically discovering how to create a project in Unity and discovering the Unity interface. Today we're going to hopefully get a bit more in depth, and we'll be talking, if you hadn't guessed from the title of the video, we'll be talking about the building blocks of a Unity project. The idea is for you to understand by the end of this video, at least have a basic idea of what a project is made of, how can you decompose basically a project. I'm going to assume we're trying to make a game here. So the game would be the project, and in the game you'll have several levels. In Unity, a level is what Unity calls a scene. So a game being made of several levels, Unity's projects are made of several scenes. So you may have noticed that what I'm showing on the screen isn't exactly what we had in the previous episode. This is just an example of something I was working on a couple of months ago, just because it has more content and it will be easier for me to show you what I'm trying to demonstrate here. So you might be wondering, well, where do I see all the scenes I have created eventually? So the first thing to note is that scenes are actually assets, which you can find in your assets folder. So if I go here in my folders, I have a folder called scenes, in which I have one folder per actual scene, and this is a scene. You see, it's called intro.unity. That's a scene. Okay, so fair enough. We've determined that a project is made of scenes, and we know where to find the scenes. But then I have two questions for you. The first one is, well, which scenes are actually going to be kept in the final build? And second of all, and perhaps most important, how do I know which one is the first to be launched? The answer to those questions is in File, Build Settings, which is going to allow you to parameter the build you're going to compile. And in the settings, as you may have imagined, you'll have at the top here, scenes in build, in which you're going to list all of the scenes you want in your final build. And you may have noticed a little number here, which is going to determine the order of these scenes. More importantly, it's going to determine which one is the first one. So, rather important to take care of this. Rather important, so keep that in mind as we go forward. So, now that we've ascertained that a project is made of several scenes, a legitimate question is, what is a scene made of? If you recall from my previous video, I said that in the hierarchy, you're going to find the list of all the game objects in a scene. So that's right, you guessed it, a scene is made of what you call game objects. And these game objects have specific properties, which you have to understand to go forward. And we're going to go over what is exactly a game object. So I like to think I have an experimental approach to programming, and we're going to use this exact same method here. So let's discover together through a bit of a study of what a game object is. And the simplest way is to take what's called an empty game object. So that's in game object, create empty, and you'll create an empty game object. Oh, you can do it from here too. Nice to know. Anyway, so it's here, it's in the list of game objects in the hierarchy, which is normal. And when you click on it, in the inspector panel, you'll have all the information on your game object. So let's have a look at what you find in the simplest game object possible. So first of all, you have this little tick here, which can turn on and off. It's not going to do much on an empty game object. The idea is when it's off, your scene is not going to consider it exists at all. It's going to blank it out completely. So we're going to leave it on for now. It has a name, so every game object has a name, good to know. So let's rename it hello. Then on the right you have this other tick for static. It's basically going to tell the system this object is not going to move, and is going to help for rendering, basically for shadows, lighting, reflections. It's to make those sorts of processes more efficient. Not the most important for now. Then you have tags and layers, which are basically filters. So just to give an example, if you don't want some certain action to happen to certain types of objects, you can give them a certain tag. just to identify them as a group, really, to segregate them, really, basically. So that's about it. It's basically their filters. And then finally, you have the most important component, actual component of a game object, which is the transform. Now, there's no such thing as a game object which does not have a transform. It's impossible. So, what's a transform? So, before we go precisely into what the transform is, the transform is what you call a component. And a game object is essentially a list of components. I like to consider components as properties. We'll go into details fairly soon, but just keep in mind that the transform is actually a component. So, the component is in this list of components, of which there's only one for now, because it's an empty game object. And so you can hide it and show it over here. And on the right, you'll note a little cog. So that's also another thing which appears on all components. And it's a list of options, some of which don't even exist. That given a command which doesn't even exist on the transform is delete. You cannot delete the transform of a game object. It does not make any sense, once again. You can only have, and you have to have, one transform on your game object. And why, you might ask? Because the transform is going to give you basically information on its position, its rotation, and its scale. So obviously, as you may well imagine, you cannot have two transforms, you cannot have two positions for a given object. It just doesn't make any sense. Similarly, if you had a cube, it has to be somewhere. It cannot not be anywhere, if you catch my drift. So you have to have a transform all the time. There are some moments where it's a bit silly. For instance, on a script. A script, so a bit of code you'd write, is going to be a component, actually. It's a component. Now, regardless of the rotation, the position of the scale of your script, it's still going to work basically the same way, normally. So, it doesn't always make much sense, but it's just something you have to roll with. You always have a transform. Now, what are the other options you can have? What other components you have, apart from transforms and scripts? Well, you have a whole bunch of stuff, actually. It ranges from audio emitters to what you call an audio listener, more on that in a second, to light, rendering 3D objects, what you call meshes, that kind of stuff. It's basically anything you need in a game is going to appear in terms of components, really. And that's why, essentially, a scene is almost exclusively made of game objects, because these game objects are made of components. And almost any scene can be found as a component, really. So that's the basic idea. And if you can't find it as a component, it's because you have to script it. So that's the basic idea of what a component is. So now, to justify why I'm showing you my game footage, we're going to give a couple of examples of how this works. Moving on to example number 1, we're going to take a look at one of the two things you find normally when you create a new scene. It's the camera. So obviously, the camera is of paramount importance because it's what's going to allow you to render things on the screen. So I have a couple of extra things down here, but don't mind too much about them. They're not very important. What you're mainly going to find is a camera and a flare layer, and as well as an audio listener. So let's talk a bit about the importance of these things. So the camera is going to give you information. As you see, every component is going to have properties really relative to what it's trying to do. So for instance, the camera is going to have a background color, not the most important thing. What type of projection your camera is going to have, the field of view, basically important stuff relative to your component. So you'll notice also, apart from the transform once again, which is unique, every single component has a little tick, which similarly to the tick at the top of your game object is going to say, ignore this exists, turn it off. In terms of code, it's enable. So here enable is true, enable is off. I'm not sure why it's changing things here, but let's give an example here. So I'm going to launch my game. So for now you see it's on, and you can fool around with these options while the game is running, really, within the limits of making your game crash, of course. Let's see what happens if I click camera, the little tick. Oh, what do you know? Suddenly I see scene is missing a full screen camera. Let's go on and do some stuff here. We basically don't have anything apart from some basic UI. So let's put back the camera. It's much nicer with. Well, there we go. So this, of course, you can emulate in code as well, enabling and disabling cameras or whatever component you want, really. I'm just doing it manually instead of coding it because it's easier. So this is example number 1. Moving on to example number 2, the audio listener. So let's see what happens if I disable it. So disabling it basically means it's as if it wasn't even there. So I disable it, and what do you know, lo and behold, oh, nothing happened. Oh, there we go. There are no audio listeners in the scene. Please ensure there's always one audio listener in the scene, and only one, might I add. So why is he saying that? Because the audio listener is the microphone of your game. It's going to be the way it's going to determine which sounds to output to your speakers, really, especially when you're going to start considering like 3D sources. Like if you want a sound to appear in one place and you want the sound to diminish as you're further away from the source, you have to know where the microphone actually is, really. So audio listener, fairly important. If you have this message, know that it's because you probably deleted the audio listener or disabled it, or had several, which once again makes no sense. Well, it could make sense, but it just doesn't happen. Interesting note on when the message appeared. You'll notice that my game is mostly silent, and the audio listener, I'm going to turn it back on here, basically turned on when I clicked on the button as UI, which produces a sound here. See what I mean? When I clicked, it created the sound, and when it realized it can't output it anywhere, the message appeared. That was example 2. So those were basically the building blocks of your Unity project. Keep in mind, a project is made of scenes, a scene is made of game objects, and the game object is made of components. And these components are what makes the magic of your game. I hope you enjoyed this video. Feel free to leave any advice, comments, and if you liked it, leave a like and subscribe, and stay cool!